Welcome back to the Face of America channel.
On the screen she glows so bright, a beacon for America's might. Her spirit fills the night with light, history's tales in her heart take flight. Every evening at 9, the tune of the anthem, it echoes profound. Taps follow a solemn sound, uniting hearts no matter the ground. Stand tall, hand over your heart. Patriotism, our shining start. Together we'll face any part. With love and courage, we won't depart. From the storms to the sunlit days, our spirits burn, never sway. In unity we find our ways, with warmth in our hearts, come what may. She shares her love, her story true. Through every trial we stand anew. With hope in our eyes we pursue a future bright without a clue. In every heart a flame so bright, guiding us through night and day. With courage and strength we unite, to honor those who keep us strong today. Stand tall, hand over your heart. Patriotism, our shining thought. Together we'll face any part. With love and courage, we won't depart.
In the beginning, at least as we like to remember it, American criminal justice was supposed to be simple in its core commitments. If the government accused you of a crime, it had to prove it in public, before a jury of ordinary citizens, under rules written down in a constitution that begins with 3 audacious words: "We the people." The Sixth Amendment captured that promise in a single sentence. Quote, "In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury." End quote. To the founding generation, that wasn't a technicality, it was the beating heart of our liberty. John Adams warned that, quote, "Representative governments and trial by jury are the heart and lungs of liberty." End quote. And that without them, the people would be, quote, "ridden like horses, fleeced like sheep, worked like cattle, and fed and clothed like swine and hounds." End quote. Thomas Jefferson called trial by jury, quote, "the only anchor ever yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution." End quote. The jury was not a side feature, it was the people themselves stepping between the individual and the state. But if you walk into an American courthouse today, you will not see that vision playing out in most cases. You will see crowded dockets, hurried conversations in hallways, and a quiet phrase that has come to dominate the entire system: plea bargain. In the federal courts, 97.9% of all criminal convictions now come from guilty pleas, not trials. Only about 2% of federal criminal cases ever reach a jury. Across the country, the American Bar Association reports that nearly 98% of convictions nationwide are the result of guilty pleas, not verdicts after a full trial. The anchor the founders trusted has been pulled up and stored away. Somewhere between the parchment and the present, a bargain replaced a trial, and a negotiation in the shadows replaced the public judgment of a jury. To understand how that happened, and how public defenders became both a shield and a cog in that machine, we have to trace the history of how the right to counsel grew, and how the right to trial quietly shrank. For much of American history, the Sixth Amendment's promise to have the assistance of counsel was interpreted narrowly. It meant the government couldn't stop you from hiring a lawyer. It didn't mean the government had to give you one if you were poor. In many state courts, indigent defendants stood alone, facing trained prosecutors and complex rules, with no one at their side. That changed in 1963 when a poor drifter named Clarence Earl Gideon was charged with breaking and entering a pool hall in Florida. Gideon asked the judge to appoint him a lawyer. The judge refused. Gideon represented himself at trial, was convicted, and sentenced to prison. From his cell, he wrote a handwritten petition to the United States Supreme Court. In Gideon v. Wainwright, the court held that lawyers in criminal cases are, quote, necessities, not luxuries, end quote, and that states are required under the 14th Amendment to provide counsel to defendants who cannot afford an attorney in serious criminal prosecutions. This decision triggered a transformation. States began to build systems of indigent defense. Some created full-time public defender offices, others relied on appointed private attorneys, paid by the government, and many adopted hybrid models. Over the 20th century, the idea of a public defender, an attorney employed by the state to represent those who could not pay, moved from controversial experiment to standard feature of American courts. Yet even in its early history, the public defender concept carried tension. Reformers like Clara Foltz argued that if the state paid prosecutors to pursue convictions, it should also pay defenders to protect the accused, to balance the scales. Others worried that lawyers paid by the government might be too close to the very power they were supposed to resist. The question lingered beneath the surface. Could a lawyer funded by the state truly stand against the state when it mattered most? For a time, the focus was on building the offices, hiring the lawyers, and fulfilling the promise of Gideon. But while the right to counsel was expanding, another force was reshaping the landscape: the rise of plea bargaining as the default way to resolve cases. Plea bargaining existed in some form in the 19th century, but it was rare and often frowned upon. Trials were expected. The public, the press, and the community watched as evidence was presented, and juries decided guilt or innocence. Over the 20th century, however, as criminal codes expanded, caseloads grew, and the machinery of prosecution became more powerful, plea bargaining moved from the margins to the center. Today, the numbers tell a stark story. In any given year, about 98% of criminal cases in federal courts end in plea bargains, according to a 2023 report from the American Bar Association's Plea Bargain Task Force. That same report concluded that plea bargaining, quote, has become the primary way to resolve criminal cases in the United States, end quote, and warned that the practice often, quote, puts efficiency over fairness, end quote, and can lead to innocent people being coerced into guilty pleas. A 2025 compilation of plea bargaining statistics highlights that nearly 26% of all exonerated individuals in the National Registry of Exonerations originally pled guilty, underscoring how often innocent people feel pressured to admit guilt. The same report notes that in fiscal year 2022, 97.9% of all federal criminal convictions were the result of guilty pleas, and that the state court felony convictions are the result of plea bargains in approximately 94% of cases. What does that mean in layman terms? It means that the constitutional right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury has become, for most people, a theoretical right rather than a lived reality. The courtroom drama we imagine, witnesses on the stand, cross-examination, jurors deliberating, is now the exception. The rule is a quiet conversation between lawyers, often in a hallway or a small office, where the stakes are enormous and the pressure is intense. In that world, public defenders are not just advocates, they're also gatekeepers to the trial itself. Overwhelmed by caseloads, constrained by limited resources, and facing prosecutors armed with mandatory minimums and sentence enhancements, they must constantly weigh the risk of trial against the certainty of a plea. The system, as it is structured, rewards speed and finality, not the careful testing of the government's case before a jury. To see how far we've drifted from the founders' design, it helps to place their words side by side with our current reality. Jefferson insisted that trial by jury was, quote, the only anchor that could hold government to constitutional principles. Adams believed that without juries, the people would be reduced to beasts of burden under the control of those in power. The Sixth Amendment enshrined the right to a public trial by an impartial jury, and the Fifth Amendment promised that no person would be deprived of liberty, quote, without due process of law. Yet in the modern plea-driven system, the jury is often bypassed entirely. Prosecutors can threaten defendants with decades-long sentences if they insist on going to trial, while offering dramatically lower sentences, or even time served, if they plead guilty quickly. This difference between the plea offer and the potential post-trial sentence is often called the trial penalty, and it's one of the most powerful tools the state has to secure guilty pleas. The American Bar Association's task force found, quote, substantial evidence that innocent people are coerced into guilty pleas because of the power prosecutors hold, including the threat of mandatory minimum sentences. Advocacy groups and scholars have documented how this dynamic turns the right into a jury trial into a high-risk gamble, rather than a guaranteed protection. In this environment, public defenders operate under extraordinary pressure. Many offices report caseloads that far exceed recommended standards, with some defenders handling hundreds of cases at a time. When a lawyer has only minutes to meet a client before a hearing, little time to investigate, and a judge urging both sides to work it out, the path of least resistance is often a plea. Not because the defender is malicious, but because the structure of the system pushes everyone toward the same outcome: a quick resolution, a guilty plea, a closed file. From the founder's perspective, this would look like a quiet revolution. The people's role of jurors has been sidelined. The public trial has been replaced by private negotiation. The protections they saw as the heart and lungs of liberty have been traded for administrative efficiency, and the very lawyers who were supposed to be necessities, not luxuries, for the poor, now find themselves in many cases as the last link in a chain that leads away from the jury box and into the plea room. One of the most powerful forces driving plea bargains is not a statute or a courtroom speech, it's time. Specifically, the time a person spends in jail before they have ever been convicted of anything. On any given day in the United States, over 400,000 people are held in jails without being convicted of a crime, according to recent pretrial detention data. The Prison Policy Initiative's whole pie analysis shows that roughly 485,000 people are in pretrial detention, meaning they are legally presumed innocent but are locked up while their cases move slowly through the system. Many are there simply because they can't afford bail. The United States Supreme Court has acknowledged that, quote, liberty is the norm, and detention prior to trial or without trial is the carefully limited exception, end quote. But research summaries on pretrial detention show that in practice, detention has become common, and it has profound effects on case outcomes. Studies compiled in the recent pretrial research indicate that people held in pretrial detention are more likely to plead guilty, more likely to receive harsher sentences, and more likely to suffer long-term economic and social harm. Imagine the position of a person sitting in a county jail. They've lost their job, their family is struggling, they may be sleeping in a crowded cell, dealing with violence, illness, or isolation. Their public defender visits briefly, juggling dozens of other cases. The prosecutor offers a deal. Plead guilty today and you can go home soon, or at least sooner than if you wait for trial. Refuse and you may sit in that cell for months, or even years as the case drags on. This is where the abstract right to a speedy and public trial collides with the reality of clogged dockets and limited resources. Speedy trial rules exist on paper, but continuances, backlogs, and strategic delays can stretch cases far beyond what most people would consider speedy. For someone in a cage, every week feels like a sentence. The plea becomes not just a legal decision, but a survival strategy. In this way, pretrial detention becomes a form of leverage. It's not always written into the statute book as a tool of coercion, but it functions the same way. The longer a person is held without trial, the more pressure builds to accept whatever deal is offered. Public defenders, aware of their client's suffering and the risks of a trial, may strongly recommend pleas as the least bad option. The system doesn't need to shout to be coercive. It only needs to let time do the work. One of the most disturbing features of the modern plea system is that it does not merely ensnare the guilty, it also captures the innocent. The 2025 Plea Bargaining Statistics Report notes that nearly 26% of all exonerated individuals in the National Registry of Exonerations originally pled guilty. These are people who, years later, were proven innocent through DNA evidence, recantations, or revelations of misconduct, but who, at the time of their cases, felt compelled to say the words, "I am guilty," in open court. Why would an innocent person do that? The American Bar Association's task force points to the substantial evidence that innocent people are coerced into guilty pleas because of the power imbalance between prosecutors and defendants, the threat of long mandatory sentences, and the pressures of pretrial detention. Advocacy organizations like Fair Trials warn that people accused of crimes are, quote, increasingly pressured into giving up their right to a trial, end quote, and that plea bargaining can become a way for states to paper over deeper failures in their justice systems. For someone facing a potential decades-long sentence if convicted at trial, a plea that offers a few years or even probation can feel like the only rational choice, even if they didn't commit the crime. Fear of the trial penalty, mistrust of the system, and the immediate pain of pretrial detention all combine to make the plea seem safer than the truth. Public defenders again are caught in the middle. They may believe their client is innocent, or at least that the state's case is weak, but they also know the judge's reputation, the jury pool, the sentencing range, and the realities of their own limited time. When they advise a client to take a plea just to be safe, they're not necessarily betraying their duty. They're responding to a system that has made the exercise of constitutional rights dangerous. From the founders' perspective, this is upside down. The Constitution was supposed to make the exercise of rights safe and the abuse of power dangerous. Jefferson wanted, quote, trials by the people themselves, not quiet deals brokered under duress. Adams believed that without juries, the people would be, quote, fleeced like sheep. Yet in the modern system, it is often the assertion of the right to a jury that carries the greatest risk, while surrendering that right through a plea is rewarded. No system this entrenched survives by accident. There are institutions, organizations, and professional cultures that support, rationalize, and sometimes seek to reform the plea-driven status quo. The American Bar Association's Criminal Justice Section convened a plea bargain task force that in 2023 released a major report acknowledging that plea bargaining has become the primary method of resolving criminal cases and calling for fairer, more transparent practices. The report did not call for the abolition of plea bargaining, but it did warn that the current system often, quote, lacks transparency, and it can be, quote, unjust and unfair. The Plea Bargaining Institute, launched in partnership with organizations like Fair Trials and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, describes itself as a, quote, global intellectual home for academics, policymakers, and practitioners working on plea bargaining. Its mission is to collect research, share knowledge, and promote collaboration around the role of plea bargaining in criminal processes. At the same time, prosecutors' organizations and reform-minded groups like Fair and Just Prosecution publish issue briefs on plea bargaining, acknowledging that it is central to modern prosecution and offering recommendations for how elected district attorneys can use it more fairly. These efforts show that even within the system there is a growing recognition that something is deeply wrong when almost every case ends in a plea, and when innocence is no guarantee of a trial. Yet for all the reports and task forces, the basic structure remains. Overloaded public defenders, powerful prosecutors armed with mandatory minimums, judges managing crowded dockets, and a culture that treats the jury trial as a rare event rather than the norm. The founders' vision of the jury as a constant check on government power has been replaced by a professionalized negotiation between insiders. The question, then, is not just how we got here, but what can be done, legally, ethically, and practically, to move closer to the constitutional promises that were supposed to define American justice. An honest discussion of remedies has to begin with a clear disclaimer. What follows is general information about legal principles and civic strategies. It is not legal advice. It does not create an attorney-client relationship. It's not tailored to any specific case, jurisdiction, or individual situation. Anyone facing criminal charges should consult a qualified, licensed attorney in their own jurisdiction to obtain advice about their particular circumstances. Laws vary by state and change over time, and the stakes in criminal cases are too high to rely on general information alone. And now that we've gotten through my legal disclaimer, with that said, there are two levels at which remedy can be imagined. The personal level, where individuals navigate the system as it exists, and the civic level, where we the people push to realign the system with the Constitution's text and the Founders' intent. On the personal level, the core constitutional principles remain: the right to counsel, the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to an impartial jury, the right to confront witnesses, and the right to not be compelled to incriminate oneself. Understanding these rights in plain language, asking questions, insisting on seeing the evidence, and discussing the risks and benefits of trial versus plea with a competent attorney are all part of making informed decisions. The law is complex, and no script can substitute for real legal counsel. But knowledge of these rights can help people recognize when they're being pressured to surrender them too quickly. On the civic level, the remedies are broader and more structural. The founders did not imagine a passive public. They expected citizens to serve on juries, to hold officials accountable, and to insist that the Constitution be more than ink on parchment. Jefferson spoke of trial by jury as part of the creed of our political faith. Adams saw it as a fortification against being ridden like horses by those in power. Reclaiming that vision means first telling the truth about the current system, that almost all cases end in pleas, that pretrial detention and the trial penalty create powerful incentives to plead guilty, and that innocent people are sometimes swept into that current. It means supporting reforms that reduce excessive pretrial detention, narrow the gap between plea offers and post-trial sentences, and ensure that public defenders have the time and resources to prepare for trial, rather than being forced into triage. It also means taking jury service seriously. When citizens show up, listen carefully, and hold the government to its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, they breathe life back into the Sixth Amendment. When they understand that the jury is not a rubber stamp, but a constitutional safeguard, they become, in Jefferson's words, the anchor that holds government to its principles. Finally, it means remembering that the Constitution is not self-executing. It does not enforce itself. It is a promise that must be claimed, defended, and sometimes wrestled back from systems that have drifted away from it. The founders gave us tools: juries, public trials, the right to counsel, the right to confront witnesses, the right to remain silent. But they also warned that those tools would rust if not used. In the end, the story of public defenders and plea bargains is not just a story about lawyers and judges. It's a story about us, about whether we, the people, will accept a system where deals in back rooms replace trials in open court, or whether we will insist that the words written in 1789 still mean what they say. Sources for this video are GetNux, Plea Bargaining Statistics Market Data Report 2025, United States Sentencing Commission Data Reports, American Bar Association 2023 Plea Bargain Task Force Report, NPR, Illinois. The vast majority of criminal cases end in plea bargains, a new report finds. Legal Clarity, Federal Court Conviction Rate Statistics and Plea Bargains. Consortium for the National Equal Justice Library, A Brief History of Public Defense in the United States. Public Defender, United States, Wikipedia. The Early History of Public Defense, Woman Lawyer. The Trials of Clara Foltz. Sarah Mayu, Free Justice, A History of the Public Defender in 20th Century America. Prison Policy Initiative, Pretrial Detention in Different Parts of the Justice System. U.S. Courts, Probation and Pretrial Services Annual Report 2023. GetNux Pretrial Detention Statistics Market Data Report 2025. Bureau of Justice Statistics State Court Processing Statistics Series. Advancing Pretrial Pretrial Detention Research Summary. Plea Bargaining Institute, Fair Trials, Plea Bargaining Campaign, and American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section. Plea Bargaining Task Force, Fair and Just Prosecution, Plea Bargaining, Issues at a Glance. Ammo.com, Founding Fathers Quotes on Criminal Justice and the Right to Counsel in the Sixth Amendment. Arkansas Trial Lawyers Association, Founder Quotes. History.com, Why Americans Have a Right to Trial by Jury. Thomas Jefferson's Jury Quotes compilation. If this were a courtroom drama, this is where the verdict would be read and the story would end. But the truth is, the case of we the people versus the modern justice system is still very much in progress. There is no single ruling, no final judgment, no neat closing argument that ties everything together. What we have instead is a record of promises made in the Constitution, of warnings spoken by our founders, of decisions like Gideon versus Wainwright that expand rights, and of practices like mass plea bargaining and coercive pretrial detention that have in many ways hollowed those rights out. We have statistics to show how rarely juries are called, how often pleas are entered, and how many people sit in jail without a conviction. We have stories of innocent people who pled guilty out of fear, and of public defenders who fight valiantly inside a system that often asks them to move cases, not test them. The question that remains is not just legal, it's moral and civic. Do we accept a system where the right to a jury trial is more myth than reality, or do we insist patiently, persistently, and publicly that the words written in the Sixth Amendment still matter? Do we allow time, fear, and pressure to dictate outcomes in back rooms, or do we demand that the people, sitting as jurors, once again stand between the individual and the state? The founders left us more than quotes. They left us with a structure that assumes an engaged, informed, and courageous citizenry. The remedy they trusted most was not a statute or a commission. It was the people themselves, and that means the story you tell, the questions you raise, and the light you shine on this system are not just commentary, they're part of the remedy. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. A Prayer by George Washington. Almighty God, we make our earnest prayer that Thou wilt keep the United States in Thy holy protection, that Thou wilt incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, and entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another, and for their fellow citizens of the United States at large. And finally, that Thou wilt most graciously be pleased to depose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, without a humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation. Grant our supplication, we beseech Thee, through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.